A real-life nightmare on Elm Street. Not the movie, not fiction, but something that unfolded in a quiet New England town where people once left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. This was the kind of place where safety felt like a given until one day it wasn't. What began as a string of petty burglaries and strange disturbances would spiral into kidnapping, torment, and ultimately the brutal annihilation of an entire family. 2 households shattered, a community scarred, and investigators left with a case so dark, it still haunts them decades later. Welcome back to Darkly Speaking. My name is Alex Kern, and every Monday I release new episodes on true crime cases and paranormal stories. You can watch episodes on YouTube and Spotify or listen to the audio episodes wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the pod so far, please consider rating it 5 stars on Spotify and or Apple Podcasts. It really helps support the show and gives me a chance to hear from you all as well. All right, now for today's episode, I need to warn you all that this story is extremely dark and twisted. It's one that's left 2 families broken, a town forever scarred, and investigators haunted by what they saw. It forces us to confront a chilling question. Is evil born? Is it made? Or does it sometimes emerge from both? In this case, the answer feels chillingly clear. This is the story of a real-life nightmare on Elm Street, a tale bound up in the murder of the Gustafsons, the torment of the Bowens, and the monstrous descent of Daniel LaPlante, all converging in the quiet corners of small-town Massachusetts. December 1st, 1987, Townsend, Massachusetts, a small, tight-knit New England town where crime was rare and the idea of violent death was something you read about happening somewhere else. But not here, not in Townsend. Andrew Gustafson lived with his wife Priscilla and their 2 children, Abigail just 7 years old and William only 5. That afternoon, Andrew had been at work making calls home that went unanswered. At first, it was just strange. Maybe Priscilla had stepped out, maybe the kids were noisy, or maybe she just hadn't heard the phone. But as the hours stretched on, the silence began to weigh heavier. It wasn't like her not to answer. Finally, Andrew drove back to their house, but something about the house felt off before he could even cross the threshold, as though the silence itself was heavy and unnatural. He called for his wife, no response. He called for his children, still nothing. Just silence. Slowly peeking around corners of his home, Andrew was met with nothing but silence. Step by step, he began to climb the staircase, each creak underfoot echoing too loudly in the stillness. As he pushed open the bedroom door, the scene stopped him cold. Priscilla lay face down on the bed, a pillow soaked in blood covering her head. She was partially covered as though someone had staged her in that position. In an instant, Andrew's world collapsed. His wife was gone. He didn't have it in him to search for the children after that. Overcome with terror and agony, he ran out of the house, panicked and desperate. When police arrived, Andrew met them outside. His words were numb, detached, almost unreal. He told them his wife was upstairs, dead, and pregnant. When an officer asked how he could be so certain, Andrew's response was chilling in its simplicity. Because of what he had seen, he just knew. He admitted that he hadn't searched for the children, though he had already feared the worst. He told them quietly that he believed they too were probably dead. The crime was already unthinkable, yet the walls of that home still held secrets that would drag investigators into something far darker. What lay beyond that bedroom would reveal a nightmare no one in Townsend could have imagined. And it was only the beginning. The flashing lights of cruisers painted the quiet Townsend street in red and blue as Detective Joe Lawless pulled up to the Gustafson home. Crossing the threshold, he was met with an air that felt heavy, as if the house itself resisted his presence. Each step deeper into the rooms carried a sense of intrusion or something unspeakable. The wooden stairs groaned beneath his weight, every creak echoing far too loudly in the silence that felt alive with dread. At the top, the master bedroom waited. Lawless opened the door and froze. Priscilla Gustafson lay face down on the bed, a pillow soaked with blood covering her head, punctured with bullet holes. She was partially clothed, one hand tied to the bedpost, a cruel detail that spoke of control and degradation. On the nightstand, as if deliberately placed in view, sat a half-empty bottle of beer and an open condom packet. The sight suggested not just violence, but a deliberate violation, a calculated humiliation. The horror only deepened as Lawless pressed on. Moving cautiously from room to room, he reached the upstairs bathroom. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and what he saw would stay with him forever. The tub was filled with still water, its surface deceptively calm, until his eyes fixed on the small form of 5-year-old William. The boy lay face down, motionless, as though someone had forced him underwater and held him there until the last desperate breath was gone. Downstairs in another bathroom, officers discovered Abigail, 7 years old, fully clothed, and drowned in the tub just the same. To imagine what it would have taken to force those small bodies beneath the water, to hear their cries, to feel their struggle, and to continue anyway, is to confront evil in its purest form. Monstrous and inhuman. Even seasoned investigators, hardened by years of crime scenes, found themselves shaken. For Townsend, this wasn't just murder. This was a shattering of safety itself, an entire family destroyed within the walls of their own home, and from that night forward, the town would never sleep peacefully again. The Gustafsons were no strangers to their neighbors or community. Andrew was an attorney, steady and professional. Priscilla taught Sunday school and kindergarten, gentle, warm, and beloved by the children and families who knew her. To friends, they seemed to embody an idyllic life, a young family rooted in faith, love, and community, with their future stretching out ahead of them. Detective Lawless knew from the very beginning that he had to treat this case as he would any other homicide, and that meant starting close to home. Even through Andrew's devastation, investigators had a duty to question him, to clear him before they could move further. As word spread, Townsend itself was left reeling. This wasn't an abstract act of violence, it was the destruction of a family many knew personally. Parents pulled their children close. Doors that had once been left unlocked were bolted tight. A chilling unease settled over the entire town, one that would linger for years. And as the grief spread through the community, the case began to draw wider eyes. Reporters from Boston descended on Townsend, eager to cover the story that had shattered this quiet New England town. What unfolded next would not only change the town's history, but put it under a spotlight it had never known before. Townsend, Massachusetts was small-town America, even though it sits just about an hour outside of Boston. With roots stretching back to the 1600s, it was a town rich in history, tradition, and quiet New England charm. In the 1980s, only about 10,000 people lived there. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved across the street, children played freely, and doors were rarely locked. That sense of peace was obliterated in an instant. The murder of the Gustafson family was so horrific it shocked not only Townsend, but the entire state of Massachusetts. Boston media descended almost immediately, followed by national outlets. The tragedy of this small-town family was suddenly being broadcast to the world. Fear seeped in everywhere, and people who once felt safe now bolted their doors, pulled curtains tight, and whispered about the danger lurking a little too close to home. The entire community was on edge, eyes darting at anything or anyone that seemed out of place. Investigators followed standard procedure, turned their attention to Andrew Gustafson. They checked his alibi and traced his steps, but it didn't take long to determine that he had no involvement. This man had just lost his pregnant wife and his 2 children, his entire family in just one unthinkable day. The grief was crushing, the kind of devastation no one could imagine surviving. Still, Andrew recalled details that seemed a little strange. Days earlier, there had been a burglary at the house. A cable box was missing, and a glass of beer or some kind of drink had been left out inside. At the time, those details felt minor, but now, in the wake of murder, they carried a chilling weight. Investigators began piecing together a working theory. Perhaps Priscilla and young William had returned home and interrupted a burglary in progress. The intruder, panicked at being caught, lashed out. The confrontation spiraled into an impulsive act of violence. Hours later, when Abigail returned home, she too became a victim, the last one killed. Police believed the murders might have started out as an impulsive crime born out of fear, but for the people of Townsend, It didn't matter how it began. All they knew was a killer was on the loose. No one knew who it was or when they might strike again. So, everyday life was just suspended in terror, and the calm that had defined Townsend for centuries was gone. When Lieutenant Thomas Lane of the Pepperell Police Department heard about the murders, the brutality reminded him of one name: Daniel LaPlante. LaPlante had already been arrested for kidnapping, and despite being only 17 years old, he was well known to police. According to Lieutenant Lane, Daniel was no ordinary teenager. He was a very dangerous individual. Cold, calculated, a smart young man on a clear path of escalation. His crimes had already shifted from routine breaking and enterings to something darker. Now, investigators feared he had crossed into the most sinister and evil acts they had ever seen. December 2nd, 1987, the morning after the murders, Townsend was paralyzed with fear. Everyone knew a killer was on the run. Police urged residents to stay vigilant, keep their doors locked, and avoid going out unless absolutely necessary. The unsettling truth was that authorities had no idea what had motivated the killer, or if or when he might strike again. The fear only deepened because of the recent string of burglaries in the area. The Gustafson home had been burglarized in the days leading up to the murders, and detectives began to wonder if the crimes were connected. Investigators discovered that the rash of local break-ins had all begun after a young offender named Daniel LaPlante was released from jail. Suddenly, things began to click. The pieces were falling into place. Detectives eventually tracked LaPlante down at the Townsend Public Library. They approached him to ask questions, but the interaction quickly left them uneasy. Daniel claimed he had an alibi, that he was at a birthday party during the time of the murders, and that others could confirm it. But his demeanor told a different story. He was jumpy, suspicious, evasive. Then, before long, he fled. With no evidence directly tying him to the Gustafson murders, investigators couldn't charge him. Still, the interview cemented Daniel LaPlante as a person of interest. Detectives eventually began digging into his background, determined to learn everything they could. What they found was a disturbing history. Not only had LaPlante committed crimes in Townsend, but also in the neighboring town of Pepperell. He had already been arrested for several of those offenses, and though he was out on bail, his record revealed a clear and troubling pattern of escalation. About a year before the Gustafson murders, another family in a nearby town would have an experience straight out of a horror movie. Frank Bowen lived in Pepperell, Massachusetts, working as a bus driver and raising his two daughters alone after losing his wife to cancer in 1986. His eldest, Tina, was a high schooler, while her younger sister, Karen, was still in middle school. The three of them were grieving and trying to cope, though Frank's long hours often left the two girls home alone for long stretches of time. Struggling with their loss, Tina and Karen began trying to contact their mother. They held a seance in their home, hoping desperately for some kind of sign. While conducting the seance, they started to hear strange noises, knocks on the walls. Soon after, more strange things began to happen. Lights they knew they had turned off would mysteriously be back on. Objects moved from place to place without explanation. The TV channels would change randomly when the girls would leave the room. And when they spoke to their mother, asking questions aloud, knocks would respond from the walls, as though someone or something was answering. At first, Tina and Karen believed wholeheartedly that these were signs. To them, it was evidence that their mother truly was reaching out from beyond. They told their father that her presence was in the house with them. Frank, however, believed his daughters were simply struggling with grief. He thought they needed psychological help, not encouragement of something paranormal. The difference in belief created a painful disconnect. Tina and Karen convinced their mother was near. Frank certain it was only imagination. But everything changed on December 8th, 1986. On December 8th, 1986, the Bowen family returned home to find something that set their nerves on edge. One of the toilets in the house had been used, and none of them had been home. Immediately, they realized an intruder had been inside. Uneasy but determined, they began searching the house, not prepared for the nightmare they were about to uncover. When Frank stepped into his bedroom, the horror revealed itself. Waiting inside was a young man, his face smeared with war paint, draped in an oversized coat, and gripping an axe. It looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie, except this was no fiction. It was happening inside their home. The intruder was disturbingly calm. He showed no emotion, no hesitation, and left them bound in the bedroom. His demeanor wasn't frenzied or wild. It was deliberate, cold, and chillingly controlled. Despite the terror, one of the daughters, Tina, managed to slip free and escape. She ran to a neighbor's house, reported the kidnapping, and called police. Within minutes, Lieutenant Thomas Lane of the Pepperell Police Department arrived at the scene. Police swarmed the Bowen home, searching every room, the woods nearby, the roads in and out of town, but the intruder had vanished. Lieutenant Lane, who had investigated murders, suicides, and strange deaths, later admitted that he had never encountered anything like this before. During their search, officers found the hatchet discarded just outside one of the doors. Beyond that, there was no trace. No member of the family could positively identify the man who had terrorized them. His disguise, the war paint, the oversized coat, and the sheer terror he instilled made it impossible for Frank or his daughters to describe him clearly. The first assumption was that if this intruder truly did exist, he had already fled into the woods, and in the darkness, it would have been easy to disappear, and nearly impossible for police to track him. But one thing was certain: Frank Bowen now knew his daughters had been telling the truth. Something had been inside their home, and it wasn't just in their minds. The Bowens were understandably terrified, so none of them wanted to go back into the house. That night, they packed up and left for a hotel, knowing they could never sleep peacefully under that roof again. On December 10th, 1986, just 2 days after the home invasion, Frank Bowen returned to his house. As he approached, a chill gripped him. In the upstairs window stood the same man as before, staring directly at him. Frank froze. The figure seemed to be taunting him. Certain this man meant to kill them, he immediately called the police. Officer Stephen Bezinson arrived about 10 minutes later and found Frank shaken to his core. Frank explained that he had just seen the intruder again, watching him, even waving from the window. But something didn't make sense. After the original incident, police had locked the Bowen house tight. As Bezinson circled the property, he found no footprints in the snow, no broken windows, no forced doors. Everything looked untouched. So none of it added up. Still cautious, Bezinson unlocked the front door and slipped inside. Almost immediately, his eyes were drawn to the wall. A family photograph hung there, stabbed straight through the center with a large knife. Next to it, in thick black marker, were the words, "I'm still here, come find me." At that moment, Bezinson knew. The intruder hadn't disappeared into the woods. He was inside. Moving quietly, Bezinson searched further. Down the hallway, another family photo hung on the wall. Just like the first, a knife had been driven into it. Scrawled beside it in the same marker were more chilling words. "I'm going to kill all of you." The threat was undeniable. Realizing the danger, Bezinson called for backup. A sergeant soon joined him, and together they searched the house inch by inch. Closets, under beds, between mattresses, anywhere a person could hide. Their search led them to the basement laundry room. In frustration, Bezinson thought, "Why can't we find him?" And then he noticed it. A set of pipes running from the basement ceiling toward the upstairs bathroom, concealed behind a false wall. The space was narrow, but just big enough for someone to squeeze behind. Switching on the light, Bezinson spotted something strange. A 4-foot-high pile of dirty clothes stacked unnaturally neat against the wall. Alarm bells went off. Cautiously, he began shifting the clothing aside. Then he saw it, a glimpse of black hair. In that moment, Bezinson knew he had found him. The intruder slowly turned his head, eyes flat and expressionless, calm, unmoved. Bezinson drew his pistol and ordered him to show him his hands. The young man rose slowly, and Bezinson moved in to arrest him. The figure who had terrorized the Bowen family, scrawled threats across their walls, and hidden within their home, was revealed at last: 16-year-old Daniel LaPlante. Detectives were struck by his unconcerned manner following the arrest. For a teenager caught in such bizarre and threatening circumstances, he seemed oddly detached. It became immediately clear that, despite his age, Daniel was very, very dangerous. According to Lieutenant Thomas Lane, for the first and only time in his career, he took 6 mugshots of LaPlante instead of the standard 2, convinced that somehow, someday, those photos might be needed again. Daniel LaPlante was born on May 15, 1970 in Townsend, Massachusetts. His parents divorced when he was still young, leaving his mother to raise him alone. She eventually remarried and had 2 more sons. But Daniel's childhood was marked by darkness from the very beginning. He would later claim that he had been sexually, physically, and psychologically abused by multiple adults in his life, including his father, his stepfather, and even his psychiatrist. Allegedly, it was his father who was responsible for the majority of the abuse. From an early age, Daniel displayed troubling behaviors that teachers and neighbors couldn't ignore. He struggled in school and was diagnosed with dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, and other learning disabilities. He attended elementary school in Townsend and later St. Bernard's High School in Fitchburg, where he briefly played football and track. But school was always a source of frustration and failure. Among classmates, Daniel was viewed as odd, unsettling. Some described him as, quote, creepy and, quote, weird. Teachers and neighbors often echoed the same, that he seemed, quote, strange and, quote, disturbed. He was considered a loner, unable to connect with others, and as the years went on, that isolation only deepened. As a teenager, Daniel was referred to a psychiatrist because of his abnormal behavior, poor appearance, and lack of hygiene. He was diagnosed with hyperactivity disorder, but his problems went far deeper than restlessness. Instead of improving with treatment, Daniel seemed to spiral further into antisocial, unpredictable behavior. By his teens, LaPlante had moved from strange behavior to outright criminal activity. He was arrested numerous times for breaking into neighbors' homes, stealing jewelry, money, and other belongings. These break-ins earned him a notorious reputation in Townsend, not just as a troubled kid, but as someone to be feared. The burglaries also gave him something else, a sense of power and control over other people's lives. Even as a teenager, it was clear that Daniel LaPlante was different. Not just troubled, but deeply disturbed. And by the time he reached 17, his petty crimes and burglaries were already escalating into something far more sinister. After the Bowen incident, Lieutenant Thomas Lane immediately requested that Daniel LaPlante be held without bail on charges of kidnapping. He also pushed for a full mental evaluation, convinced that LaPlante's behavior revealed someone deeply unstable and dangerous. Detectives also pressed the assistant DA to move the case forward quickly, determined to get it in front of a judge before delays could endanger the community further. As investigators pieced things together, they uncovered a disturbing detail. Tina Bowen, one of Frank Bowen's daughters, had actually dated Daniel LaPlante once. Their connection began over the phone, where Daniel charmed her into meeting up. Eventually, they went on a single date for ice cream. But over the phone, Daniel had misrepresented himself, what he looked like, who he was, and when Tina met him in person, she immediately got a bad feeling. She later said he gave her the creeps, the heebie-jeebies. After that one date, she broke it off, deciding that she didn't want to see him again. Daniel, however, wasn't ready to let go. That one date became the catalyst for a fixation that turned sinister. For the next 6 months, he was in and out of the Bowen home, not just breaking in, but living inside it. He would remove electrical outlets so that he could spy on the family through the walls. From his hiding places, he'd wait until the Bowens left a room, then sneak out to stage disturbing acts. He'd drink milk, change TV channels, move objects around, sparking arguments between the sisters and leaving Frank baffled. And when suspicion grew, Daniel would just slip back into his crawl spaces, completely undetected. Everyone knows the feeling of hearing a bump in the basement or imagining a monster hiding in the closet. In the Bowen home, those fears weren't imaginary. They were real. The man who had once taken Tina out for ice cream was now tormenting her entire family from inside their own walls. To this day, Daniel LaPlante has never revealed what his true intentions were for the Bowens. Whether his plan was to kill them, terrorize them indefinitely, or something else entirely remains unclear. What is certain is that this wasn't just petty burglary or childish pranks. It was the calculated cruelty of someone escalating towards something far darker. While being held, LaPlante was sent to Bridgewater Hospital for psychological evaluation. Doctors diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. Afterward, he was placed in juvenile detention. Everyone believed the community would be safe with him locked away, but that sense of security wouldn't last. 1 year later, in 1987, Daniel LaPlante resurfaced. He lived on Elm Street in Townsend, Massachusetts, just a mile through the woods from the Gustafson house. Officially, he was supposed to be in juvenile detention, or at least that's what everyone thought. When Daniel LaPlante turned 17, the court decided that he should be tried as an adult. That decision changed everything, because as an adult defendant, he was now eligible for bail. He was brought before a judge, not yet for trial, but for a bail hearing. At that hearing, with no police input and no investigators present, the judge made a fatal choice. Daniel LaPlante was released on $10,000 bail. To secure his release, LaPlante's mother mortgaged their home and put up the $10,000. And just like that, a dangerous young man who had spent months tormenting a family, who had kidnapped and threatened them, was free to walk the streets again. Looking back, detectives would call this one of the gravest mistakes imaginable. LaPlante wasn't just troubled, he was dangerous. From stalking and psychological terror to kidnapping with an axe in hand, he had shown what he was capable of. And now he had been set loose. So when news broke of the Gustafson murders on December 1st, 1987, Lieutenant Thomas Lane's mind went immediately to one name. He recalled thinking to himself, I wonder what Daniel LaPlante is doing lately. By the next morning, investigators had connected the dots. Daniel had a violent past, a juvenile record, and he was out on bail. But most chilling of all, he lived on Elm Street, just about a mile through the woods from the Gustafson home. But at this point, they had no hard evidence tying him directly to the murders. At 7 a.m. on December 2nd, Detective Joe Lawless and his team reconvened at the Gustafson home to gather as much information and evidence as possible. Outside the house, they discovered a pillow lying in the yard. So they called in the Massachusetts State Police Canine tracking team to begin a scent search. The dog immediately picked up a strong scent from the pillow, leading investigators into a nearby woods. Within minutes, a state trooper found a wet flannel shirt and a pair of wet gloves. Police believed these items could have been used in the drowning of the Gustafson children. The canine tracked the scent from those clothes, weaving through the woods for nearly a mile. Finally, the trail ended at one location, the home of none other than Daniel LaPlante on Elm Street. After conducting the canine tracking, Detective Lawless applied for and executed a search warrant for the LaPlante residence. Daniel himself wasn't home at the time, but police carefully combed through the entire property. One of the key pieces of evidence they recovered was a pair of wet socks in Daniel's bedroom. On those socks, investigators discovered a blonde strand of hair they believed could have belonged to 7-year-old Abigail Gustafson. In addition, they found spent bullets that matched the cartridges used in the murder of Priscilla Gustafson. Police knew they were on the right track. So with the evidence in hand, they applied for an arrest order for Daniel LaPlante. But by then, it was too late. Daniel had already fled, and a manhunt was officially on. With the evidence mounting, police released Daniel LaPlante's photo to the public. Within hours, the story exploded across the media. His face appeared on the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, plastered across headlines everywhere. Reporters and camera crews swarmed the quiet town of Townsend, and the community realized they had a murderer on the loose. Lieutenant Thomas Lane, the officer who knew LaPlante's violent potential better than anyone, prepared himself for the search. For the first and only time in his career, he strapped on a bulletproof vest before heading out. Lane believed LaPlante would head toward northwest Pepperell, a rural, heavily wooded area that he knew well, the perfect place to vanish. Almost immediately, reports came in of a suspicious young male spotted in that very area. The search zeroed in on a wooded section bordered by 4 roads. Detectives began circling the perimeter to box LaPlante in. Lane pulled into the driveway of one of the homes on the edge of the search area. A woman had just returned and nervously told him, "I know why you're here. Could you please come inside with me while I re-enter my house?" Lane obliged, asking his partner to stay in the cruiser while he accompanied the woman inside. It couldn't have been more than a minute after entering when a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Lane asked the woman if she had a pet. She said only a cat. But Lane knew instantly that wasn't a cat. Moving upstairs, Lane found a 16-gauge shotgun lying at his feet. He believed that the thud he heard was LaPlante dropping the weapon in his escape. In hindsight, Lane was convinced LaPlante had intended to ambush him with that shotgun, and what prevented it was the presence of Lane's partner waiting outside. The husband of the house later confirmed that while the shotgun belonged to him, a handgun and a belt of ammunition were missing. It was obvious LaPlante wasn't just hiding. He was arming himself, preparing for a deadly confrontation. Meanwhile, fear gripped Pepperell and Townsend. Residents locked themselves inside, terrified of the armed killer loose in their woods. Police dispatchers were overwhelmed with calls. Every shadow, every creak in the night sparked panic. The fear was justified. This wasn't a petty burglar anymore. This was a murderer, desperate and dangerous. What followed became one of the largest manhunts in Massachusetts history. Officers from multiple agencies, state police, and local departments fanned out, determined to catch Daniel LaPlante before he could kill again. Everywhere you turned, there was a police cruiser, an officer on foot, or a canine unit combing the woods. Law enforcement knew Daniel LaPlante was armed, dangerous, and capable of killing again. They needed to get him off the streets before more blood was shed. Remember, this was a teenager who had once hidden himself inside the walls of a home for months. He knew how to disappear, how to slip out of sight. In the woods, he was even harder to track. Just 15 to 20 minutes into the coordinated sweep, Lieutenant Thomas Lane received word. Daniel had been spotted running into a lumber yard in the nearby town of Ayer. Panic surged among officers. With LaPlante armed, the fear was real that someone inside the yard could be taken hostage or even killed. Police quickly cordoned off the area, sealing the streets. A police helicopter hovered overhead, scanning the lumberyard from above. Officers searched cautiously, weapons drawn. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew this could turn into a deadly standoff. As the search continued, one officer paused. Convinced he had heard something near a large dumpster, several officers surrounded it, weapons trained, and ordered Daniel LaPlante to come out. Finally, after days on the run, LaPlante surrendered. He was taken into custody and transported to the state police barracks on Elm Street in Concord, Massachusetts. Daniel LaPlante was officially charged with the murders of Priscilla Gustafson and her two children, Abigail and William. Detective Joe Lawless, who sat near him during the trial, would later recall that LaPlante had the coldest eyes he had ever seen. No remorse, no emotion, just completely expressionless. A soulless person, he said. The case against LaPlante was overwhelming. The shell casings found in his home matched the exact type used to murder Priscilla Gustafson. The blonde hair found on one of his wet socks was confirmed to belong to 7-year-old Abigail. During a search of LaPlante's property, police found the actual murder weapon, a .22 caliber revolver hidden in an abandoned vehicle. Police also recovered 2 stolen cable TV boxes and remote controls from a prior burglary at the Gustafson home, proving LaPlante had been inside before the murders. LaPlante was tried in Lowell, Massachusetts at a courthouse located almost eerily at the intersection of Elm Street and Gorham Street. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for the killings of Priscilla, Abigail, and William Gustafson. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. When you think about this case, the name Elm Street keeps surfacing like a grim omen. Daniel grew up and lived on Elm Street in Townsend. After his arrest, he was taken to the state police barracks on Elm Street in Concord. He was later prosecuted and convicted at a courthouse sitting on Elm Street in Lowell. In total, there are 7 different Elm Street connections that haunt the story of Daniel LaPlante, a bizarre thread woven through one of Massachusetts' darkest true crime cases. The town of Townsend was forever changed. This was a small New England community where doors had once been left unlocked, where neighbors trusted one another, and where people believed they were safe. But after the murders, fear lingered in every home. Parents watched their children more closely, doors were locked, and the idea of safety in small-town America was shattered. So when Frank Bowen, the father whose family had been terrorized by LaPlante just a year earlier, learned of the Gustafson murders, he felt a chilling confirmation of what he had always feared. He had warned that Daniel was dangerous, that he was escalating. Now, the unimaginable had happened. Frank later said that when he thought of LaPlante, the only words that came to mind were, quote, pure evil. For Andrew Gustafson, the nightmare of December 1st, 1987 never ended. He had walked into his home, expecting to find his family, his pregnant wife Priscilla and their 2 children, Abigail and William. And instead, he discovered a scene of unthinkable horror. Andrew remarried years later, but the shadow of that day never left him. When asked if he could forgive Daniel LaPlante, Andrew's answer was simple and unwavering. Quote, "I will never forgive him. I will never speak his name," end quote. He carried the memory of Priscilla, Abigail, and William with him until he died from cancer in 2014. Nearly 30 years after the murders, LaPlante returned to court to take advantage of a Massachusetts law passed after the U.S. Supreme Court banned mandatory life without parole for juveniles. Standing before the court, LaPlante read an apology. Quote, "I do not have the words to fully express my profound sorrow, but I am truly sorry for the harm I have caused. From the very essence of who I am, from the depth of my soul, I am sorry," end quote. But his words rang hollow. To those who knew the case, it felt like manipulation, not remorse. Psychiatrist Fabian Saleh later evaluated LaPlante following his hearing. His conclusion was damning. LaPlante showed, quote, "no empathy," and, quote, "continued to minimize his behaviors," end quote. To the families, his apology was nothing more than performance. Priscilla's sister, Christine Morgan, testified that her sister would never have wanted LaPlante to see the light of day again. Andrew's second wife, Carol Gustafson, told the court that Andrew had been, quote, "plagued," end quote, "by nightmares of his family's murder until the day he died from cancer in 2014. She made her plea clear, quote, "do not let this man out. He should rot in prison," end quote. The judge sentenced LaPlante to 45 years in prison before eligibility for parole. Then, in 2019, a separate Massachusetts law allowed juveniles convicted of murder to petition for parole after 30 years served. Judges were granted discretion to reduce sentences, but the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld the prior ruling, ensuring Daniel LaPlante remains behind bars. For detectives like Joe Lawless and Thomas Lane, the Gustafson murders remained the darkest case of their careers. Even for seasoned investigators, it felt like staring into pure evil. And for Townsend, the story is a scar that never fully healed, a reminder that horror doesn't just live in movies or legends, sometimes it lives right down the street. I don't think there's really any such thing as justice in a story like this. On one side, you have a boy who grew up in darkness, a child marked by abuse and trauma who became a monster capable of unimaginable cruelty. And on the other side, you have 2 innocent families who paid the price for it in the most devastating ways. The Bowens were left traumatized, never knowing the safety of their own home again, haunted by the knowledge that someone had lived inside their walls. And then the Gustafsons, an entire family erased on what should have been an ordinary afternoon, leaving Andrew to carry a grief and a memory no human being should ever have to endure. Until the day he died, he carried the weight of that scene, haunted by nightmares, burdened by grief, and never truly finding peace. Just like a nightmare that never fades, this is a story that stays with you. It stays with me because whether evil is born, made, or some twisted combination of both, what's certain is that it can take many forms. And once unleashed, it spreads like wildfire. And it doesn't hide in shadows or in legends. Sometimes it lives in the places we think are safest. If you want to dig even deeper into this case, check out our website, darklyspeakingpodcast.com, where you can find all of the source materials and show notes. And don't forget to follow along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast for more dark and chilling content. As always, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.